Whether Hiryu's AA contributed to the final demise of some of VT-3's remnants is unknown. However, it contributed to the demise of one Zero at least, that of Lieutenant Fujita. Hit by friendly fire while pursuing the Americans into the heart of the formation, his Zero had quickly caught fire. From Hiryu's bridge, Lieutenant Nagayasu saw Fujita's plane hit and careen toward the water. Nagayasu was sure that the pilot had been killed. Fujita, however, was extraordinarily lucky. He was already at very low altitude, 200 meters, but he climbed out of the cockpit and popped his chute, which fortuitously opened just before he hit the water. The departure of the Americans and the onset of fire. And then, just as quickly as they had come, the Americans were gone, roaring off toward the east, hugging the waves to escape retribution from both guns and fighters. The Kapi fighters, many of whom had been engaged with VT-3 and who were now chasing the attackers away from the fleet, could only catch peripheral glimpses of the horror unfolding behind them. And under mounting pillars of smoke, the bewildered crews of 3 great ships turned to face the implacable foe that all sailors dread fire. WTE-era warships were marvellously flammable. Anyone who has been on board a ship of that vintage will have noticed that one of the prevalent odours present is that of petroleum distillates, in the form of lubricants, solvents, gasoline, and thousands of tons of fuel oil. Added to this, of course, was ammunition for the ship's guns, which was stored primarily in the magazines, but smaller quantities of which were kept in ready storage lockers near the guns for quick access during an attack. In contrast to today's warships, oil-based paints were used extensively. Wiring ways were filled with insulation that could ignite at high temperature, as could piping insulation, which in Japanese warships was often made of wood. Damage control lockers themselves contained wood beams for shoring, and additional shoring material was usually stowed in the overheads of companionways and anywhere else sufficient space could be found. Warships were, and still are, full of paper reports, forms, charts, manuals, and blueprints. Below decks there was cotton bedding for the crew, which numbered between 1,100 and 1,700 men for each of the 4 carriers, as well as their clothing and personal effects. For the comfort of the men, Japanese berthing spaces often had false wooden flooring over the steel decks, with floor mats and wooden messing tables stored underneath. The galleys contained cooking oil, grains, and combustible foodstuffs. Grease deposits could be found in the stoves and ventilator ducts leading from these spaces. The sick bay stored ether and other volatile liquids. The ship's laundry contained uniforms and rags, as well as lint deposits in the dryers and ventilators. All Japanese shipboard furniture was wooden, including chairs, tables, workbenches, and so on. Wooden furniture made perfect sense for a country that had to import practically all its iron ore, and hence reserved steel for truly essential items. The net result is that warships of the day burned easily and well. Aircraft carriers compounded these basic problems with specialized ones of their own. For one thing, their flight decks alone represented anywhere from 50 to 125 tons of combustible wood. Far and away, the worst fire hazard for carriers, though, was their aircraft fueling system. Carriers typically could refuel aircraft on both the hangar decks and the flight deck. A typical Japanese carrier had a dozen fueling points for both high-octane and normal-octane aviation gasoline on the flight deck, 10 more on the upper hangar deck, and 8 on the lower hangar deck. A series of vertical fuel mains cross-connected the forward and aft aviation gasoline tanks to horizontal petrol lines, one apiece level for high and normal-octane fuels, that ran around the circumference of each hangar deck. Vertical risers fed the fueling stations located in the tubs along the edge of the flight deck. Thus each carrier was crisscrossed by a web of fuel lines, each of which was filled during flight operations with highly flammable liquids. Furthermore, the nature of the cross-connections in the system made it likely that problems in one area of the ship would be carried to unaffected areas via the fuel lines themselves, and potentially all the way to the main Avgas storage tanks. The storage tanks were isolated from the ship's other spaces by cofferdam compartments filled with CO2 gas, so as to insulate them from sparks and other hazards. However, the tanks and cofferdams on Japanese carriers were notable for being integrated into the actual structure of the ship. This meant that shock stresses applied to the outside of the hull were directly communicated inward to the avgas tanks, making them particularly vulnerable to cracking and leaking as a result of combat damage. In later years, the Japanese would fill these voids with concrete to try and minimize this hazard, but at the time of Midway, these structural deficiencies were evidently not appreciated. The second major complication with carrier design and operation was that of moving and stowing aircraft ordnance. Unlike a battleship or cruiser, whose ammunition handling arrangements were flash-tight and protected behind the heavy armour of the barbette and turret, carriers, particularly Japanese ones, were not provided with anywhere near the same degree of protection. Yet the weapons being trundled about were in some senses more lethal than a battleship shell. General-purpose and semi-armour-piercing bombs contain a much higher relative percentage of explosive than an armour-piercing shell, most of whose weight is comprised by the heavy metal casing necessary to pierce armour. A GP bomb can be nearly 50% explosive by weight. Against a lightly armoured target, bombs cause much more damage proportionately than a shell. Unfortunately, this is equally true of the interior of one's own carrier, should such a bomb detonate there. As a result, carriers must take every possible precaution to prevent such events from occurring. Japanese carriers typically stowed their aircraft ordnance in 2 bomb rooms fore and aft, as well as a torpedo magazine located adjacent to one of the bomb rooms. The location varied from ship to ship. Armour protection over the magazines for most Japanese carriers was minimal. There was always one, and sometimes several hoists leading upward from each bomb room. However, flash-tight doors were apparently not fitted over the upper apertures of the hoists. It can be seen that these arrangements would be barely adequate under normal peacetime operating conditions. If a large fire were present on the hangar deck, they might well be disastrous. With such flimsy precautions, it was imperative to follow proper ordnance handling techniques, promptly stowing bombs and torpedoes back below when not in use. All the navies of the time recognized the potentially lethal nature of fires and explosions on their carriers and took precautions to prevent them. The primary Japanese method of fighting fires hinged on isolating the conflagration and then actively extinguishing the blaze. All Japanese hangar decks were capable of being subdivided across their width by track-mounted rolling fireproof screens. These were placed on either side of each of the elevator wells. Larger compartments were also divided in the middle. Thus, several subcompartments could be created at need to isolate a damaged or burning section of the hangar. If the screens were damaged, however, there were few physical obstacles to prevent fires from sweeping the length of the hangar. Both upper and lower hangar decks were equipped with foam systems, which sprayed a mixture of seawater and soap bubbles onto the deck. The nozzles for these systems were placed at 1.5 and 2 metres above the deck and were fed by fire mains that girdled the deck, much the same way as the fuel lines. Fire hoses, fed from ring mains powered by pump rooms deep below in the ship's machinery spaces, were also available on the hangar decks and flight decks. However, unlike American carriers, which could divide their mains into numerous segments, Japanese mains were simply divided port and starboard. This meant that a single hit could knock out half the water supply on the ship. Furthermore, older vessels often used cast-iron water pipes, which were much more vulnerable to shattering than steel pipes. As a result, Japanese carriers were much less likely to emerge with firefighting water pressure still available after taking a large bomb hit. On the lower hangar deck, where explosive fuel vapours were most likely to accumulate, an additional CO2 flooding system was deployed. A perforated metal pipe running the length of the overhead of each lower hangar deck section could be used to discharge CO2 and extinguish flames. The CO2 tanks for this system were stored at the bottom of the elevator wells. Sufficient tankage was provided to displace 18% of the total volume of the lower hangar space. This system depended on a tight seal of the fireproof partitions. A significant leak in the curtains or the bulkheads would admit enough oxygen to cause the system to fail. Even if successful, it was essentially a one-shot deal. Once the CO2 tanks were discharged, they could not be readily replenished. What the CO2 system did was buy time for the firefighting teams. With the fire temporarily abated, the men could rush into a space and begin applying water to cool the debris, thus potentially bringing the fire to a halt in a large section of the hangar all at once. All of these mechanisms were to some degree hampered by the construction of Japanese hangars. Fundamentally, the two variables that affect hangar deck design are whether it is enclosed or unenclosed, in other words, whether it can be opened readily to the outside air, and whether the flight deck above it is armoured or unarmoured. Each of the three major carrier forces in the Second World War adopted different philosophies on this topic. The Royal Navy enclosed their hangars on all sides with storerooms, ready rooms, and other compartments, and placed a heavy armoured deck over the top that composed a significant portion of the ship's longitudinal strength, a strength deck in the parlance. This had the advantage of directly protecting the hangar from bomb hits, but it also carried with it serious penalties. First, the addition of a heavy armoured deck high in the ship's structure made limiting the size of the deck itself crucial, as well as limiting the overall height of the ship. Dual hangar deck arrangements, i.e., two hangars stacked one atop the other, were impossible in such designs, because they would have raised top weight unacceptably, and thereby destabilized the ship. The fact that elevator openings also had to penetrate the strength deck meant that these openings had to be kept to a minimum in both number and size. This had a negative effect on aircraft handling and on how quickly the carrier could spot a strike for launch. As a result, Royal Navy carriers carried relatively small air wings. British fleet carriers deployed around 48 aircraft, in comparison to the 60-100 that the US and Japanese navies operated from their big flat tops. The US Navy had opted for an unarmoured flight deck on its carriers and designed its ships so that the hangar deck was the strength deck. The lighter flight deck structure and lack of compartments surrounding the hangar allowed the hangar itself to be relatively large. Furthermore, the hangar was open on the sides in several locations, although it could be closed off from the elements by means of rolling metal screens. While these screens were not completely light-tight, and therefore presented a hazard to a ship in blacked-out steaming conditions, or vapour-tight, they could also be rolled up to expose the hangar completely. Thus, American carriers had the advantage of being able to refuel and warm up aircraft on the hangar deck if need be. Dangerous items in the hangar, such as explosive ordnance, could be expeditiously disposed of by simply shoving them out the openings and over the side. These same openings allowed escort ships to contribute directly to firefighting by letting them spray water directly into the hangar deck. It was recognized that the unarmored flight deck, though relatively easy to repair, exposed the hangar below to bomb damage, and there is no question that the Americans in some cases paid heavily for this design philosophy, particularly against the late-war kamikaze threat. The relative merits of armoured versus unarmoured can be argued ad nauseum, but the bottom line is that the Americans were firmly committed to the proposition that an aircraft carrier was a power projection asset and that power projection was impossible without an adequately sized air group. Given these imperatives, the USN was apparently willing to accept the risks attendant in their designs. And it must be admitted, whatever their failings, that American carriers as a whole were highly successful during the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese chose a design direction that in retrospect clearly afforded the worst of both the US Navy's and Royal Navy's philosophies. However, this was not readily apparent before the war started. Japanese carrier designers favoured enclosed hangars à la the Royal Navy. However, to facilitate the operation of an adequately sized air wing, most Japanese fleet carriers had at least two hangar levels, upper and lower. The hangars were not open to the elements beyond the provision of portholes in some locations and used forced air ventilation systems. For this reason, aircraft were not warmed up in the hangars, although refuelling was performed there. The practical effect of these arrangements in terms of damage control were potentially dire. Just like putting a firecracker in a tin pot, any detonation in an enclosed space tends to magnify the explosion. Japanese hangars were prone to the same phenomenon. Japanese warships of this era often suffered from overweight and stability problems. Moreover, with their dual hangar configurations, some Japanese carriers had fairly tall profiles as well. The dual hangar deck design meant that the Japanese had to reduce topside weight by any means possible. An armoured flight deck à la British carrier designs was simply out of the question. Gun tubs were supported by braces and struts that would have looked flimsy to a Western observer, and protruding platforms in some cases carried perforated decks, all in an attempt to reduce weight. In some, Japanese carriers were suspect from a structural standpoint, and were ill-prepared to absorb damage and continue functioning. This was particularly true of Soryu and Hiryu, which did not benefit from being constructed atop a relatively sturdy capital ship hull, as Akagi and Kaga were. The Japanese suspected some of these weaknesses. In the design of the newer Shokaku-class ships, for instance, the hangars contained bulkheads that were designed to be blown outward to vent the blast overpressures, albeit the design did not perform as advertised. Yet at its root, the Japanese Navy was wedded to the primacy of the offence. They believed in power projection no less fervently than the American Navy did. But because of their design philosophies, Imperial naval vessels were notably less damage-resistant than those of their opponents. Now, after having suffered a shattering attack at the hands of the enemy, these weaknesses were about to be exposed in the most graphic manner imaginable. Kaga was the first, and in many ways the worst hit of the three. At the time of the bombing attack, Lieutenant Kunisada Yoshio, Kaga's assistant damage control officer, had been below decks near the hangar, discussing the AA action with some other crewmen. When the bombs came in, the noise was like battleship guns firing. The ship trembled hard. Soon after, the loudspeaker barked that 2 bombs had hit near the rear and there was a fire. Immediately, the lieutenant ordered all the men near him to grab fire extinguishers and begin to combat the blaze, and sent messengers to roust further men to do the same. The men ran off to the hangar deck to carry out his orders. Kunisada himself left to gather more sailors, rounding up about 20 men in short order. He then started making his way back toward the hangar deck. The conditions in Kaga's hangars immediately after the bombing were horrific beyond description. Bodies and pieces of bodies of Kaga's armourers and mechanics lay strewn everywhere among the wreckage of her aircraft. In the open air, a 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb has a 50% chance of killing anyone standing within a 30-foot radius of the blast centre. Inside the confines of the hangar deck, these lethal effects were greatly magnified. Kaga lost 269 mechanics on 4th of June, most of whom undoubtedly died on the upper hangar deck in the first few minutes of her ordeal. Mechanics, plane handlers, and armourers alike were slaughtered by the score blown apart, immolated, crushed under the aircraft they had been servicing, or mown down by shrapnel as they crouched on the bare metal deck, seeking shelter where there was none. In the swelter of the hangar, labouring heavily while pushing planes and ordnance around, many of the men had stripped down to shorts and short-sleeved cotton shirts. These men, even if they lived through the bombing, were likely to have received flash burns. Taken together, the initial hits on Kaga probably killed or badly wounded almost every man in the upper hangar. The few men who survived there were undoubtedly shocked into near insensibility. The incredible noise of the explosions had been stunning even to men standing on the bridge. The noise level in the hangars had been literally deafening. The general cacophony, in combination with the explosions, fire, and rapid spread of smoke, meant that many of the men were incapable of action, either to save the ship or themselves. They would have wandered aimlessly, unsure of whether or how to escape the conflagration. Many were crawling. Others, perhaps many of the wounded, would have been unable to move far in any case. Even for those still mobile, the difference between life and death would have hinged on the slightest of happenstances. With the fires blazing up in all directions, running into the wrong burning corridor, or finding a hatch or companionway blocked in front of you meant death. Shutting oneself into a smaller compartment, even if it seemed to offer temporary sanctuary from the blaze in the hangars, brought death as well. Having the good fortune to have left the hangar for a quick trip to the head or to run an errand below decks might have meant life. Though Lieutenant Kunisada may not have realized it, with at least 4 hits placed along the length of Kaga's upper hangar, any realistic hope of containing the ship's damage had been destroyed. Japanese damage control practice was to isolate the damaged area and fight the fire locally. Now, isolation of a single problem area was no longer possible. Instead, Kaga's hangar had been transformed into a time bomb. The concussions of the initial hits destroyed both her port and starboard fire mains, because 3 of the bombs hit within feet of the hangar bulkheads, along which the mains ran. To make matters worse, the emergency generator for Kaga's fire pumps was located, rather incredibly, on the upper hangar deck on the port-forward 5-inch gun sponson. This placed the generator some 30 feet away from the impact of the second bomb, almost certainly ensuring its outright destruction by fragments. The first explosions likely killed or wounded many of the men in the damage control stations scattered about the hangar deck. The fireproof roller curtains were probably open to facilitate easier movement of aircraft and ordnance. Even if the curtains were being used, several of them would have been destroyed immediately by the hits near the forward and aft elevators. Her CO2 suppression system could not be employed. Thus, Kaga's firefighting capabilities were rendered null and void from the outset. Aft of Kunisada, Warrant Officer Morinaga had discovered this already. Hearing shouts that the hangar was on fire, he left the flight deck and headed below. When he arrived, though, the situation was already totally out of control. None of the fire mains were working, so he and some other men organized a bucket brigade from the ship's latrines, which surely must have been one of the most pathetic images in a day replete with grim irony and empty gestures. Next, he tried throwing in flammables overboard, but that proved futile as well. Everything was on fire already. Worse yet, Kaga's hangar was littered with an incredible array of munitions. Between the arming of the first and second strike waves and the inability to stow the land attack weapons, Kunisada would later estimate that Kaga's hangars probably contained 20 torpedoes, 240-kilogram warhead, 28 800-kilogram bombs, and 40 250-kilogram bombs. This appalling total of nearly 80,000 pounds of explosives lay scattered everywhere, on aircraft, on bomb carts, or simply shoved against the hangar bulkheads to get them out of the way. The forward bomb hits both landed within spitting distance of the ordnance lift, which was abreast the midships aircraft elevator. The area around this lift was piled with 800-kilogram bombs waiting to be sent back below to the magazines. With the hangars fully enclosed, none of these weapons could now be jettisoned. The bombs were heavy enough, but the torpedoes were absolutely impossible to move. They weighed roughly 1,800 pounds apiece and were most likely affixed to an airplane to boot. With the elevators destroyed or inaccessible, there was no possibility of carrying them topside and heaving them overboard, and there was no way to move them out of harm's way on the hangar deck, since there were fires burning literally everywhere. Far worse, though, was the fact that the American attack had caught Kaga with her fueling system unsecured. Her fuel mains had almost certainly been ruptured in one or more places by the hits. Even if only the Type 97s and Zeros were fully gassed, there were still almost 10,000 gallons of fuel sloshing about in the aircraft, in addition to what was now pouring from the fuel lines. Freely flowing aviation fuel being dumped from many sources meant that the fuel was being distributed in large slicks all over the hangar deck. Not all of it was on fire yet, but in the presence of high ambient temperatures, aviation gasoline was now vaporizing at a prodigious rate. Though no one probably knew it, a catastrophic explosion on board Kaga could not be long in coming. Much like Kaga, the situation on board Soryu was beyond redemption in a matter of moments. The American bombs had landed almost perfectly so as to cause the maximum destruction possible. Soryu's hangars were divided into 3 fireproof bays, but Yorktown's bombers had neatly deposited a 1,000-pound bomb into each of them, destroying any possibility of localizing the blazes. The first hit had demolished the starboard side of the hangar, undoubtedly starting fires in the 5-inch ammo ready room for mounts number 1 and number 3. For some reason, the second hit had penetrated very deeply, slicing through the upper hangar to slam into the lower hangar, into the midst of Soryu's Kanbaku squadron. In the process, it had demolished the officers' quarters on the port side of the hangar and blown fragments through the starboard bulkhead, protecting the boiler uptakes, destroying them and taking the boilers offline. The third bomb landed almost directly on the number 4 arrestor wire, detonating in the upper hangar amidst the Type 97 Kanko rearming from the Midway strike. This hit destroyed numerous aircraft and engulfed the rear of the hangar in fire. Thus, at the end of the attack, Soryu found herself in a similar but worse state, if such were possible, than Kaga, not only afire from stem to stern, but also having suffered damage to both levels of the hangar. With fires already blazing on the lower hangar deck, and with no real way of fighting them in the boiler uptakes, workshops and electrical trunks located just below the area of the hit, the overheads of boiler rooms Nosma 3, 5 and 6 would soon be directly exposed to the blaze. Equally as bad, Soryu's lighter construction meant that the hits did immediate and probably irreparable structural damage. The decimation of Soryu's hangar crews was part and parcel with the terrible physical damage meted out to the ship. The horrific butchery inflicted in Kaga's hangars was replicated here in full measure. Being the smallest of the Midway carriers, the slaughter was probably even worse. A total of 419 of Soryu's mechanics, maintenance personnel and seamen died this day, and the immolation of the hangar decks in the first minutes undoubtedly accounted for the bulk of these casualties. Indeed, a third of Soryu's crew may well have been dead by the time the last of the American dive bombers completed its attack. None of Soryu's command staff, of course, could know the particulars of the disaster that had befallen their ship, but atop the island, Gunnery Officer Kanao could tell that the situation was grave. The ship was already smoking from stem to stern, thick vapours pouring forth from the bomb's wounds and spreading in black sheets across the casualties lying on the flight deck. As he cast his gaze southward, he could see Akagi. She was still moving at a good speed, but she too was afire. There was nothing left for Kanao to do at the air defence post. Everyone there was dead, and the director was out of action. Already he could hear heavy internal explosions beginning. Some were sharp and jarring. Others held the muffled thunder that betrayed deep damage to the ship's innards. He had no communication with any area in the ship, but he could imagine the horrible destruction being wrought below. Intense heat and smoke had already driven him back from the forward end of the air defence station in any case. He began climbing down the vertical steel ladder to the bridge. Peeking in, he was surprised to find that the command staff was still there. Captain Yanagimoto, Executive Officer Ohara, Hikocho Kusumoto, and the navigator, Lieutenant Commander Asanumi. Several of them were burned, but Yanagimoto was still determined to fight the ship. Shamed by abandoning his post while the bridge staff was still alive, Kanao determined to regain the top of the bridge and carry on with his duties. He turned and began mounting the metal ladder once again. Yet, as he did so, another explosion rocked Soryu and knocked Kanao from his perch. Instinctively, he grabbed for a line near to hand, but instead of checking his fall, it merely dropped him, albeit somewhat more softly than if he had fallen down into the ocean below. There he stayed, clinging to the line, which still hung suspended from somewhere above. Below decks in the engine spaces, Lieutenant Naganuma listened to the evil thunder of the explosions just above their heads. Suddenly, a violent crash bulged the deck down toward them, and red fire charged out of the ventilation ducts. Immediately, the order was given to shut them, but the explosions had warped the openings to such an extent that the smoke could not be stopped completely. the men began to cluster around those ducts that still brought in fresh air, sucking in each clean breath as if it were ambrosia. Naganuma was suddenly struck by the image of dying carp, desperately gasping for air. The temperature was already beginning to rise alarmingly. On board Hiryu, Yamaguchi and the staff of Cardiff II greeted the panoply of destruction that had befallen the mobile force with sombre disbelief. The magnitude of the disaster lent an almost surreal quality to the situation. It was impossible for the men to truly comprehend what had just happened. Below decks, the men had to use their imaginations to picture the disaster unfolding, but given the tones of the voices over the loudspeakers or men running down from above with news, it was not hard to realize. In Hiryu's main engine control room, Chief Engineer Aimune Kunize listened grimly as a voice from the bridge, probably Yamaguchi's or Kaku's, reported that all of the other carriers were hit and that their teammate Soryu, in particular, was burning very badly. It was up to the Hiryu to carry on the fight. Down in Hiryu's ready room, one of her flight leaders, Lateu Shigematsu Yasuhiro, burst in amidst the lounging pilots. There he found Lieutenants Tomonaga and Hashimoto relaxing. "Hey!" he shouted to the assembled. "The Akagi's damaged. The Kaga and Soryu are burning. We're the only ship that hasn't been hit." Rushing back topside, they joined the other crewmen on Hiryu's flight deck, gazing mutely on the terrible scene. Near at hand, Soryu was heavily afire. Further aft, the other two carriers were clearly hit as well, with Kaga burning furiously. Yamaguchi tried to make out the situation on Akagi. She was still steaming northward. To the bridge watch, he announced that the flagship was still proceeding at good speed, and her damage appeared to be slight. Appearances were deceptive. In reality, Dick Best's bomb had landed in a position to do terrible damage to Akagi, although she did not brew up as quickly as her two stricken comrades. The hit undoubtedly destroyed the fireproof curtain between the hangar and the midship's elevator well just forward, most likely blowing flaming debris downward into the lower hangar deck. The bomb also smashed the 4.7-inch ready ammunition lockers for the portside AA guns, which were located adjacent to the impact area. Far worse, of course, was its effect on the torpedo aircraft just about to be spotted for the upcoming strike. These aircraft, 18 in all, were fully fueled and armed with torpedoes. The bomb would have landed right on top of the aircraft parked nearest the elevator. It appears that the hit took some time to initiate a large blaze on the hangar deck. Certainly fire was not observed on the flight deck for several minutes afterward. This indicates that Akagi's damage was initially fairly localized. Had her damage control teams been able to react swiftly and appropriately to the situation, the fire might have been brought under control before it transformed itself into a more widespread conflagration. However, several factors conspired against this. The first, of course, was the condition of the hangar decks, which were packed with combat-loaded aircraft. A fire on so much as one of these, unless promptly extinguished, spelled disaster. Yet, getting to the blaze through the wreckage surrounding the hit would have been difficult. The second factor was the condition of the midship's elevator. It is possible that when the elevator was dumped into its well, fire may have caught hold and smouldered underneath it in the machinery pit. With the elevator lying over top, reaching the flames would have posed serious problems to any damage control team. Whatever the situation, within about 3 minutes, things began to get out of hand, as the first of an interminable series of induced explosions took hold. At 10:29, Captain Aoki, keenly aware that the ordnance hoists gave direct access to the bomb and torpedo rooms below, gave the order to flood the ship's magazines. The forward storage areas complied at once, but the situation aft was more complex. According to Nagumo's report, the rear magazines could not be immediately flooded because of valve damages. This further supports the supposition that the rear portion of Akagi had suffered extensive shock damage from a near miss aft. At 10:32, Akagi attempted to use the CO2 fire suppression system located on the lower hangar deck to extinguish the blaze. This indicates that the fire was already well established there within minutes of the initial attack. However, if the CO2 system could be brought into play successfully, the fire would be confined to the upper hangar deck only, which presumably could then be brought under control. In such a fashion, Captain Aoki's men would have been able to establish a firebreak of sorts and given themselves time and room to maneuver against the blaze above. It would also protect the ship's engines, and thereby Akagi's pumping capacity, from further damage. But it was not to be. With the fireproof screens around the central elevator well gone, it was impossible to seal off the damaged areas. It is probable, too, that the CO2 flasks had been destroyed by the bomb, because they were typically housed at the bottom of the elevator well. If Akagi's elevator had been dumped into its shaft, they were unlikely to have survived. As a result, Akagi's efforts may have been foredoomed, although the damage control personnel may not have been able to get close enough to the center elevator to realize that the system was non-functional. Less likely is the possibility that the system worked, at least initially, or at least in some areas of the lower hangar. However, fires extinguished by CO2-based systems have a nasty tendency of reigniting unless the inert gas can be constantly replenished, or the area in question can then be consistently doused with enough water to keep smouldering combustibles below their ignition point. Either way, the line of the lower hangar deck apparently could not be held. One can only imagine the gloom that must have pervaded Akagi's crew when this attempt to prevent the fires from creeping lower into the ship was seen to be unsuccessful. In the scant minutes wherein all this had transpired, the air battle continued largely unabated. As was previously related, the remnants of VT-3 were just now, at 10:35, beginning their final runs against Hiryu. American dive bombers, their ordnance expended, were trying to exit the scene. The Zeros, not surprisingly, were doing their level best to exact some measure of retribution for the calamity that had just befallen their carriers. Having shed their altitude in the course of their attacks, the SBDs were on the deck, usually alone or in small groups. Like any attack plane, their only real protection against a Zero was to stick in a tight formation of several aircraft and use the grouped firepower of their machine guns to fend off attacks. By themselves, Dauntlesses were normally rather vulnerable. However, now relieved of their bombs and already short of fuel, they were at least fairly nimble. By racing away on the deck, they were also protected from attacks from below. Nevertheless, enraged by the success of the attack, the Japanese fighters went after them. Several SBDs were badly shot up and were lucky to be able to land on their carriers later in the day. Yet in a group, SBDs were much more difficult targets than TBDs. Indeed, the Japanese probably lost almost as many fighters in the immediate aftermath of the attack than they had in the half-hour preceding it. At about the same time on board Kaga, the bill for a full morning's worth of sloppy ammunition stowage procedures came due with cataclysmic interest. Within a few minutes after the initial hits, as aviation fuel continued pouring from the mains onto the deck, the combination of heated vapour and live flame triggered a fuel-air explosion. The initial blast was so massive that battleship Haruna's executive officer was certain that no one on Kaga could have survived. An enormous orange-black fireball mushroomed skyward and was rapidly followed by at least 6 more devastating blasts. Not surprisingly, the retiring American aviators could not help but notice the explosions as well. Lieutenant Kunisada, with his hastily assembled damage control team, had just been in the process of making his way into Kaga's hangar when he and his men were blown to the deck by the enormous explosion. Instantly, all light was lost, and they were plunged into darkness. Reaching into his pocket, Kunisada took out a flashlight and shone it around. Suddenly, someone grabbed his leg. Aiming the light down, he saw a chief machinist who groaned, "I'm hit." Kunisada was able to make out that the man's leg was broken and his ankle twisted the wrong way. He leaned down to lift him up and try and help him to a side room away from the hangar, when a second terrible explosion knocked both men to the deck. Kunisada landed hard and knew no more. Crouching on the flight deck near the bridge, Amagai was stunned to watch the blasts literally blow out the hangar sides and hurl flame, equipment, and the bodies of crewmen into the water. As the explosions continued, the flames began moving toward the air station. All communications were severed with the rest of the ship. None of the voice tubes were operating. Amagai was momentarily consumed by sorrow for the men caught in the hangars and turned his eyes briefly toward the heavens. Looking away from the fires, he then noticed that Akagi and Soryu were both ablaze as well. Soryu was already dead in the water. Amagai's heart was seared by these images, and he felt unendurable mortification at the disaster that had overtaken the force. It was too much to be borne. With communications out and fires advancing toward him, the bridge was no place to stay, and Amagai scrambled down to the boat deck 2 levels below. Whether he knew it or not, he was Kaga's senior surviving officer now, and, as such, command of the carrier fell to him. Yet his exercise of command was largely directionless and did little to avail Kaga's plight. Beyond the outright damage to the ship and loss of communications, 3 less apparent factors were working against Amagai's ability to fight the ship. The first was that Amagai apparently did not know that he was in charge of the situation. Even if he had, though, his ability to control the damage control operations would have been hampered by a second failing Japanese over-reliance on its officer corps. The Imperial fleet depended much more heavily on its officers of all ranks to perform complex technical operations than either the US or Royal British Navies. Japanese officers, since they were committed to the force for an extended period of time, were given much more technical training than the enlisted men. Accordingly, Japanese officers in many cases fulfilled the role that in Western navies was accomplished by senior enlisted men. The importance of the officer corps in this respect is reflected by the fact that the Japanese Navy had a higher percentage of officers in its ship crews than its Western counterparts did. With Kaga's senior officer corps decapitated by the initial attack, she was in an inherently inferior position with regard to damage control. The third factor was Commander Amagai himself. As an aviator, he had little or no direct experience with fighting fires, coordinating communications, directing work parties, or any of the other myriad imperatives entailed in commanding a ship in extremis. Damage control, at least as far as the Imperial Japanese Navy was concerned, was the preserve of specialists. Whereas by the end of the war, the US Navy would push damage control training and technique down through the ranks until everyone on board was familiar with the topic, the Japanese had no such conception. Damage control was a supernumerary function, handled strictly by engineering personnel. As a result, the death of her 2 senior engineering commanders meant that none of the senior officers left on board Kaga really had any idea of how to contain her damage, least of all the man nominally in charge of her. Engineering personnel like Lieutenant Kunisada, who had the most knowledge of the survivors, were so far down the command chain that they too didn't realize that they were the last hope of the ship. None of these things boded well for Kaga's odds of survival, and they help explain why Kaga was fated to suffer the highest casualties of any of the 4 carriers this day. At 10:40, though heavily damaged, Akagi was still proceeding north at battle speed. Suddenly, an American plane was spotted 20 degrees off the starboard bow. Captain Aoki immediately ordered the helm put hard over to starboard to present the interloper with a more difficult target angle. The AA guns opened up as well, although their fire was less intense than it had been. The American plane passed to port without incident. But when Aoki ordered the rudder amidships, nothing happened. Akagi continued in a clockwise circle, her rudder jammed at 30 degrees to starboard. Aoki repeated the order, then immediately ordered engineering to check out the problem. Akagi's steering failure at this juncture is the final conclusive piece of evidence supporting the aft bomb hit actually being a very near miss off the fantail. Nagumo's staff officer for navigation, Sasabe Toshisaburo, flatly stated that the aft hit destroyed Akagi's rudder. The Nagumo report also mentions that Akagi's steering was damaged at 10:42. This timing strongly indicates that the rudder failed as a result of some sort of previous damage, because no direct damage was being done to Akagi's engineering spaces at this time, and the deaths of the engineering staff in the area by smoke inhalation, if indeed there were casualties there yet, would not have resulted in a steering casualty. It is difficult to construct a damage scenario wherein the effects of a bomb hit on the flight deck aft would have affected the rudder in this fashion. A hit in this region would have vented the bomb's blast down into the atmosphere above the boat deck, rather than being transmitted directly to the ship's structure. By contrast, a near miss would have placed the 1,000-pound bomb in the water very near the ship's rudder. Water is an excellent conductor of shock waves, much better than steel. It must be recalled, too, that older warships, such as Akagi, were very prone to shock-related damage, as the physical principles underlying such damage were not well understood at the time of her construction. A hit in the water close aboard would have transmitted a massive hammer blow to the hull structure and rudder that Akagi's structure would have been ill prepared to handle. A hit close aboard the aft section of the vessel also makes sense in the context of the American attack profile. Best's three-plane element had attacked from 80 degrees off Akagi's port bow, whereupon she apparently began an evasive turn to starboard. As such, the American bombs would have been coming down port to starboard across her beam. On impact, a 1,000-pound bomb would be travelling at about 450 feet second at an angle of perhaps 15-25 degrees from the vertical. A bomb just missing the overhang on the port edge of the flight deck aft would continue downward and inward toward the ship, smacking into the water close aboard and very near the rudder. Akagi's rudders included heavy lateral bracing connecting the steering post assembly to the ship's side hull, thus providing a direct mechanism for transmitting shock stresses. The mining effect and subsequent whiplash from a 1,000-pound bomb detonating nearby would almost certainly have damaged the port rudder, causing it to jam later. Likewise, the mention of sprung watertight doors in the magazine and the inability of flooding mechanisms to function is indicative of the same sort of damage. A crew would almost certainly have been dispatched immediately to diagnose the steering problem. The engine spaces were already feeling the effects of the fire above, of course, with smoke being sucked down the ventilator intakes and pouring into the engineering compartments despite the best efforts to seal up the vents. Aoki's inquiry regarding the loss of steering must have been met with a groan, as if they didn't have enough troubles already. The most likely culprits for the steering failure would have been the steering telemotor controls. Given the proximity of Best's bomb hit to the bridge, it wouldn't have been unlikely for the wires there to have been cut. But apparently that wasn't the problem, nor were the stern steering motors at fault. The problem, therefore, lay with the steering mechanism itself. About this time, Captain Aoki ordered the engines stopped. Then, at 10:42, the chief engineer ordered the evacuation of the engine spaces, telling the men to report to damage control stations topside. It is likely, though, that a damage control team would have continued trying to fix the rudder. With the steering motors apparently in good condition, the men would have proceeded aft into the rudder room itself. The twin rudder posts, each taller than a man, were jammed into this tiny space where the ship's hull tapered sharply back to the stern. The aft end of the rudder room terminated in a 6-foot-deep pit, where the posts descended to their watertight seals, and then out through the bottom of the hull. It wouldn't have taken long for the men to realize that the port rudder was damaged and would no longer turn. Next, the emergency oil pump would have been tried, at which point the engineers would doubtless have traded fatalistic glances among themselves. They knew the chances of this hand-operated device working were slim indeed. It was common knowledge among the engineering staff that emergency steering arrangements on board their warships were unsatisfactory. The manual oil pump simply didn't have the torque necessary to turn the rudder post and its enormous counterbalance. Finally, in mounting desperation, some of the men would have groped their way back forward to fetch heavy screw jacks. There were lugs welded onto the sides of the tillers for this very purpose, and they would have rigged them in haste. But these efforts must have failed too. The port rudder simply would not move. Akagi was no longer navigable, and the prospects of her being able to steer any time soon seemed remote. Whether the engineers then abandoned this compartment or stayed, gagging and losing strength, to continue their efforts is unknown. Equally unknown is whether they were able to apprise Aoki or Chief Engineer Tampo Yoshibumi of this situation before the command space's topside were abandoned. As it happened, shortly after Akagi's steering failed, the situation on the bridge had deteriorated from merely bad to overtly life-threatening. The fire, which had been confined to the hangar deck initially, had now broken through the flight deck, probably via the elevator well. At 10:43, one of the 2 Zeros in Kimura's Shotai that hadn't made it off the deck caught fire directly abreast the bridge. Immediately, a plume of heavy smoke began choking the men in the command area. It was clearly time to leave before Nagumo and his staff were roasted. On the bridge, a singularly unpleasant debate had already been occurring for the past several minutes. Perhaps numbed by fatigue or a simple stunned incomprehension of the state of the ship, Nagumo was resisting shifting his flag to another vessel. Muttering, "It is not time yet," the admiral stubbornly refused to face the facts and stood rooted to the deck near the ship's compass. Kusaka was getting nowhere in his efforts to persuade the admiral when Captain Aoki finally spoke, saying to Kusaka, "Chief of Staff, as the ship's captain, I am going to take care of this ship with all responsibility. So I urge you, the Commander-in-Chief, and all other staff officers to leave this vessel as soon as possible so that the command of the force may be continued." Thus fortified, Kusaka lost no time in applying his own pressure. The ship was afire and dead in the water, he pointed out. The radios were out, and it was clear that they simply could not longer direct the battle from her. Nagumo had his duty to do, Kusaka reminded him, and he owed it to the fleet to carry on the battle. Finally, Nagumo relented. Unfortunately, leaving Akagi's bridge wasn't as easy now as it would have been even 5 minutes before. The starboard side of the island was threatened by the flames. The door from the briefing room at the base of the island now opened directly onto the fire, and the air control platform at the rear of the island was also being scorched. The port side of the island was a sheer cliff, dropping 80-odd feet straight down to the ocean below, a killing fall. Running down the ladder to look for a way out below, the Staff Flag Secretary, Commander Nishibayashi, reported back that there was no escape that way either. Thus, the only way down now was through the windows at the front of the bridge. Someone found a line, secured it to one of the window frames, and out they went, or almost. The distance was some 14 feet down to the small fire control platform at the front of the island, and then another 6 to the flight deck itself. In the event, it seemed rather more. Not only that, but Akagi's bridge windows were only about 20 inches on a side. The diminutive Nagumo could scramble through without issue. The burlier Kusaka found it a rather tight fit. A few shoves from the staff, though, and he was expelled from the bridge. Whether from his rather cork-like exit, or because rappelling down sheer metal structures was apparently not a normal part of a staff officer's duties, Kusaka proceeded mostly to fall to the platform below, badly spraining both his ankles and burning himself for good measure. The weakened Fuchida found himself in worse straits yet. The last officer out of the bridge, he started shinnying down the line and had almost made it to the fire control platform when an explosion knocked him roughly all the way to the flight deck. Where Kusaka had gotten away with mere sprains, Fuchida found himself with 2 badly broken legs, his ankles and arches crushed. Landing on the deck like a sack of grain, he simply lay there. Limping, even crawling away, was out of the question, and the flames were advancing all the while. Thinking that this was the end, Fuchida considered his fate calmly, realizing that all he felt was an utter weariness at the whole affair. His clothing began to smoulder from the heat. Then, miraculously, 2 enlisted men arrived on the scene in the nick of time. They picked him up and carried him forward to the anchor deck on the bow, where he rejoined Nagumo and the staff of 1st Air Fleet. Before leaving the bridge, Kusaka had directed Nowaki to come alongside to receive the admiral. However, light cruiser Nagara had drawn near as well. Nowaki's launch, instead of ferrying the admiral to the destroyer, was ordered to take him and his staff to the cruiser. Not only was Nagara a larger vessel, but also she and all her sisters were designed to operate as destroyer squadron flagships, and as such had better communications facilities than their charges. Fuchida, although not part of the admiral's staff, was taken along as well. Nagumo boarded the launch, followed by the rest of the evacuees. As Genda was waiting to embark, a petty officer on Akagi's bow noticed that his hand had been burned. Pulling off one of his own white gloves, the man handed it to Genda, urging him to put it on. Turning to go, Genda was halted again by his young orderly, who had braved the darkness below decks to retrieve Genda's bank deposit book and personal seal, Han, from his cabin. Genda was deeply moved by the kindness of the two sailors, both of whom he was now leaving behind to whatever fate awaited them. But Nagumo's staff were waiting, and Genda boarded the launch. The crew began pulling on the oars. On board Akagi, the survivors watched them go, then turned back to the desperate business at hand. At the same time, Nagumo was departing Akagi. A singularly less dignified and more massive debarkation was already underway on Soryu. Her damage had been so rapid and severe, and the slaughter of her crew so wholesale, that only cursory efforts were made to save her. She had lost power almost immediately, and by 10:40 had slewed to a dead stop in the water, afire from stem to stern. Emergency steering arrangements were tried at 10:43, but in the absence of propulsion they were superfluous in any case. Clouds of whitish smoke poured from her port side, and the hangars were already completely consumed with fire. Executive Officer O'Hara, despite his severe burns, had left the bridge to try and take over the firefighting efforts. Moving down a deck to the air control platform, he tried to assess the situation, but all communications were out. It was clear, though, that the ship's fire mains were destroyed. Leaving the air station for the flight deck, he finally fainted from his wounds and fell to the deck. There, another explosion must have blown him over the side without his even being aware. The gods smiled on the injured man, for his trajectory cast him clear of the lifeboat davits and other impaling obstacles and into the water beyond. He survived the long trip down to the ocean none the worse for wear. When O'Hara came to, he found another sailor, a pharmacist's mate, swimming next to him and slapping him to keep him from fainting again and drowning. O'Hara would spend the next several hours in the water before being rescued. On the bridge, Captain Yanagimoto quickly drew the obvious conclusion: Soryu was doomed. At 10:45 he gave the order to abandon ship. Whether or not the order reached all the men, though, was questionable, as communications with the rest of the ship were undoubtedly disrupted. Whatever the reason, either the captain's order or simply wishing to preserve their lives, men had already begun jumping into the water around the ship. Others were deposited there rather more bodily, as explosions continued racking the ship. Soryu had remained under command a mere 20 minutes from the time the first bomb struck. The ordeal of her men, though, was far from over. With Admiral Nagumo in the process of transferring his flag, command over Kid Butai briefly devolved on the screen's commander, Radem Abe Hiroaki, commander of Crew Div 8. Abe wasted little time in assessing the situation and initiating action. He had received a message at 10:45 from Chikuma, informing him that her No. 5 plane had sighted 5 additional cruisers and 5 destroyers, some 130 miles from Midway. Dutifully forwarding that message to Yamamoto at 10:47, he followed up 3 minutes later with a grim communiqué. Fires are raging aboard the Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi, resulting from attacks carried out by enemy land-based and carrier-based attack planes. We plan to have the Hiryu engage the enemy carriers. In the meantime, we are temporarily retiring to the north and assembling our forces. Immediately thereafter, Abe sent a terse message to Admiral Yamaguchi: "Attack the enemy carriers." 600 miles to the west, Yamamoto's main body was ploughing along in an allegorically apropos fog. The dense mists that had bedevilled Kid Butai several days before now surrounded the commander-in-chief's formation. Several ships, including battleship Nagato, had gotten lost in the soup, slowing their progress and fraying nerves. Admiral Yamamoto sat silently, peering out of the windows at the white mantle. Suddenly, Yamato's chief signal officer burst onto the bridge, his face grim, and handed Yamamoto a message form. Yamamoto read it, stunned. He let out a groan, then, still staring out at the mists beyond, handed it back wordlessly to the signalman. To another sailor on the bridge, it seemed that the commander-in-chief had been turned to stone. Not so much as an eyelid twitched on his countenance. On board Hiryu, Yamaguchi Tamon had needed no prompting to undertake offensive action. When Admiral Abe's message ordering him to attack was received at 10:50, he was in fact just minutes away from launching. Not surprisingly, frantic preparations had been underway on Hiryu to get a counter-strike in the air since the American attack. The job fell to Hiryu's dive bomber unit, under the command of Lieutenant Kobayashi Michio Buntaicho. Kobayashi and his unit were widely regarded as among the best in the fleet. He would personally lead the first Chutai of 9 aircraft, while his deputy, Lieutenant Yamashita Michiji, would lead the second Chutai. Accompanying Kobayashi's 18 Type 99 aircraft would be 6 Zeros under the command of Lieutenant Shigematsu, junior fighter Buntaicho. He and the other pilots in the Chutai had already participated in the morning strike. Now Shigematsu led a grab-bag collection of aircraft on this vital mission. There was no time to wait to rearm Tomonaga's remaining Type 97s, so this would have to be a one-dimensional strike. Kobayashi's aircraft were equipped with a standard anti-ship loadout, wherein 2/3 of the aircraft carried 250-kilogram semi-armor-piercing bombs, while the remaining third, one plane in each shot eye, carried a 242-kilogram high-explosive land bomb fused for instantaneous detonation. The high-explosive weapons were intended to destroy AA guns and their crews, thereby hopefully suppressing the target's anti-aircraft fire and making the task of the other aircraft that much easier. It was Captain Kaku who gave the final pre-flight briefing to the assembled pilots. In contrast to this morning's optimistic atmosphere, there was none of the usual banter and kidding among the pilots. The mood was now one of deadly seriousness. The men stood silent as Kaku laid out the objectives for the strike. Hiryu's commander reminded them that theirs was the last intact aircraft unit in the fleet. Not only did they need to find the enemy and attack effectively, they also needed to return as large a percentage of their aircraft to Hiryu's decks as possible for use in future operations. Therefore, Kaku urged caution. They must attack judiciously, not rashly. Grimly determined to do their best, the men ran to their planes and mounted. At 10:54, with the funeral pyres of Cardiff 1 still clearly visible on the southern horizon and her sister a raging bonfire nearby, Hiryu turned back east into the wind and began launching. All the aircraft were airborne by about 10:58. Standing in the crew pits next to the flight deck, the deck crews wished them a silent farewell. All the hopes of the fleet now hung on the slender thread of Hiryu's air group. To the force, Yamaguchi sent the following message. All our planes are taking off now for the purpose of destroying the enemy carriers. After Kobayashi was launched, Hiryu apparently remained headed northeast on course 30 degrees and immediately brought down 7 of Akagi's combat air patrol fighters. As it developed, the combination of Hiryu's earlier evasive maneuvers against VT-3 and her recent move into the wind to launch aircraft had brought her back into the vicinity of Soryu. The condition of her wounded sister ship was positively dreadful. Flames were licking all along the flight deck, and dense clouds of black smoke were boiling from her innards. One crewman on board Hyrie remarked that she looked like a giant daikon radish that had been sliced in two. Now, in places, it was possible to see right through her to the other side. On the bridge, Yamaguchi turned to one of Hiryu's officers. "Can we contact her?" he asked. "I will try," the man replied and began to snap the shutters of a small signal lamp. "Try to save your carrier," Yamaguchi signalled. The message was sent 2 or 3 times toward the fire-racked flat top, but there was no reply. Saddened, Yamaguchi turned away from the horrible spectacle. There was little anyone could do. However, one of Hiryu's consorts, cruiser Chikuma, had also been drawn like a moth to Soryu's fiery agony, and was even now slowing to a stop. At 11:12 she sent over her No. 2 cutter to the stricken carrier's forecastle, where a damage control party could be seen. Embarked on the cutter was a pharmacist's mate and 7 sailors, clearly more to help with tending the wounded than with any firefighting. Hiryu herself could not linger. After their brief intersection, Soryu was rapidly left behind to join the other 2 forlorn smoke columns further astern. It was the last time the men on board Hiryu would see their sister ship. Having sent off the counterstrike, Yamaguchi shortly received a signal from Chikuma's No. 5 plane, which had relieved tone No. 4. He radioed at 11:10. "The enemy is in position bearing 70 degrees, distance 90 miles from our fleet's position." The enemy was indeed very close at hand. In fact, unbeknownst to Nagumo or Yamaguchi, Chikuma No. 5 was in contact with an entirely different American carrier force than Amari had originally detected. This was TF-17, centered around Yorktown. Amari had encountered it on his way back to Kid Butai. Proceeding to the spot of Amari's latest sighting report, Chikuma No. 5 had duly stumbled across Yorktown as well. What Yamaguchi thought of the enemy's proximity has not been recorded. Indeed, for the first 45 minutes or so after Kid Butai's catastrophic bombing, Yamaguchi's actions were largely pre-programmed in any case. His last orders from Nagumo had been to assume a course of 030 degrees and close the enemy preparatory to launching a counterstrike. Strictly speaking, the attack on Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi did not alter these orders a whit. Yamaguchi's launching his strike against Yorktown was not a response to the American attack at all, but simply the continuation of Nagumo's prior intentions. Hiryu's behavior confirms this. She dodged VT-3's attack in the 10:30–10:35 timeframe, then apparently resumed 030 and went ahead with her launch. Furthermore, for a time at least, Akagi had followed her until dropping back at 10:42. At 11:20, having left Soryu astern, Yamaguchi blinkered all ships an update. Second wave, composed of 18 bombers and 5 fighters, has taken off. Plan to have an additional 9 ship-based attack planes and 3 fighters take off in 1 hour. Hiryu plans to proceed towards the enemy on present course. If Hiryu was proceeding toward the enemy, she was doing so largely alone. Apart from a pair of destroyers, the other ships of Kid Butai appear to have been busy elsewhere. Nagara was alongside Akagi, collecting Admiral Nagumo. Cruiser Tone and Bat Div 3 were apparently somewhere between Hiryu and Nagara, still within blinker distance of both parties, and thereby forming a signal bridge of sorts that linked the two. Thus, Yamaguchi was operating without the benefit of any heavy cover. After Kobayashi's departure, Hiryu began arming what remained of her Kank squadron for launch, hopefully before noon. Of the torpedo attack aircraft, 7 were clearly serviceable, and another pair, including Tomonaga's, apparently had been patched up sufficiently to make the trip. Providentially, at 11:30, another Kank deposited itself on Hiryu's deck. This was an Akagi aircraft flown by W.O. Suzuki Shigeru. Suzuki had taken off at 10:15 from the flagship for a scouting mission, but had turned back, for reasons unknown, shortly thereafter. Finding his ship in flames, he had landed on Hyrie instead. Under normal circumstances, the addition of a single torpedo plane to the roster would hardly have been cause for celebration. But in this case, every plane counted. Suzuki's bird was promptly refueled and armed. It was clear, too, that in order to make maximum usage of the meagre assets at hand, it was imperative that good intelligence on the enemy's movements continue to be gathered. A happy thought, indeed. It was about 6 hours late in occurring to the Japanese. However, Yamaguchi relayed a message to Crew Div 8 at 11:30, ordering additional aircraft to maintain contact with the enemy. Unfortunately, Japan's woes in the scouting department were ongoing. Amari's No. 4 plane had been replaced by Chikuma's No. 5 aircraft. However, the pilot of this new arrival, PO-1C Takezaki Masatake, had thus far only observed TF-17 and Yorktown. As it developed, at the same time that Chikuma No. 5 was sending her sighting report at 11:10, Soryu's Type 2 aircraft was sending back a similar report detailing the position of TF-16. Unfortunately, it was later discovered that the radio in Ida's new bomber wasn't working. No one received his transmissions. It would not be until Ida returned to Hiryu in the early afternoon that Yamaguchi would finally have confirmation that the American order of battle included 2 separate task forces, with perhaps as many as 3 carriers. Nagumo's launch pulled alongside Nagara at 11:27. The Admiral scrambled up a Jacob's ladder dropped over the side of the cruiser and onto her linoleum-covered decks. Radam Kimura Susumu, commander of Destroyer Squadron 10, received the Admiral and his staff on the quarterdeck. Upon boarding the cruiser, Nagumo's first thought was to use Nagara to tow Akagi clear of the battle. Kimura, gazing on the panorama of the enormous blazing ship, greeted the suggestion with scant enthusiasm. He politely pointed out to his superior that given Akagi's current circumstances, such an operation would prove difficult, an understatement indeed.